A rich widow walked into a boardroom with a janitor. What happened next left millionaires speechless. The air inside the Harrington Enterprises boardroom was thick with anticipation. The kind that makes people sit up straighter, exchange glances, and whisper under their breath. A high-stakes meeting was about to begin, one that could determine the company's future. But no one was prepared for what happened next. When Eleanor Harrington walked in, she wasn't alone. Her sharp heels clicked against the marble floor as she moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made even the most arrogant men in the room shrink in their seats. But it wasn't her presence that left the executives stunned. It was the man walking beside her. Daniel wasn't wearing a tailored suit. He wasn't holding a leather briefcase or adjusting a Rolex. His uniform was a dark blue janitor's jumpsuit, and in his hand was a cleaning rag he had probably forgotten to put down. Silence. Executives exchanged baffled looks, shifting in their seats as if trying to confirm whether they were really seeing what they thought they were seeing. The CFO, Lawrence Whitman, cleared his throat, forcing a polite smile. "Mrs. Harrington, Eleanor raised a hand, cutting him off before he could embarrass himself further. "I invited him." Daniel looked down, clearly uncomfortable. His shoulders were stiff, and he wasn't making eye contact with anyone. It was as if he had been dropped into the wrong world, a place where he didn't belong. And yet, here he was. The executives were waiting for an explanation. This was supposed to be a critical business meeting with shareholders. Numbers, profits, losses. The kind of conversations that happened behind closed doors, with suits and cigars and deals whispered over steak dinners. Not janitors. Eleanor took her seat at the head of the long glass table. She tilted her head slightly, as if enjoying the discomfort in the room. Then, after a pause that felt like forever, she spoke. "I know what you're all thinking," she said, her voice calm. "And I don't care." But the truth was, no one in that room could have predicted what was coming next. Daniel could feel the weight of a dozen stares pressing down on him. He was used to being invisible, just another person moving through the hallways, cleaning up after people who never acknowledged his presence. But today, every eye in that boardroom was locked onto him like he was an alien who had just crash-landed in the middle of their world. He shifted uncomfortably, gripping the rag in his hands. He wanted to disappear, but Eleanor wasn't about to let that happen. She leaned forward, lacing her fingers together on the table. "I'm sure some of you are wondering why I asked Daniel to be here today," she said, glancing around at the executives. "Well, let me tell you a story. A few weeks ago, Eleanor had been walking past the staff break room on the 6th floor, a floor she almost never visited. She had been on her way to a meeting when she overheard something unusual. It wasn't small talk. It wasn't someone complaining about work. It was a discussion about investment strategies. She stopped. At first she thought maybe one of her financial advisors had wandered into the wrong room, but the voice was unfamiliar. It was steady, thoughtful, and filled with the kind of knowledge that came from experience, not theory. Curious, she took a step closer. "No, you don't want to touch that stock right now," the voice was saying. "It's got a short-term gain. But look at the market trends. The real money's in the undervalued assets. Look at what happened with the 2008 crash. People thought they could ride the wave, but the smart ones knew where to invest after the dust settled." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. She peered through the doorway and saw Daniel sitting at the lunch table with another janitor, explaining complex financial concepts in a way that made them sound simple. She stayed and listened. For 15 minutes, she stood there, fascinated. He talked about market cycles, about how certain businesses were primed for growth, about risks that most people overlooked. He didn't use the kind of language you'd hear from Wall Street guys trying to impress clients. His explanations were practical, real, like someone who actually understood money, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. It didn't make sense. Why was a janitor talking like a hedge fund manager? Eleanor interrupted their conversation, walking straight into the break room. Daniel went quiet immediately, his face turning pale. He looked like a kid who had just been caught sneaking into a movie theater. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice even. "Where did you learn all that?" Daniel hesitated. His fingers tapped against the table, nervous. Then, after a long pause, he sighed. "My dad owned a small business," he finally said. "He taught me everything he knew about finance. When he passed, I had to drop out of college. Couldn't afford it." Eleanor studied him for a moment. That was the moment she made a decision. "I want you to come with me to a meeting next week," she said. "Just sit in, listen, and if I ask you something, answer honestly." Daniel froze. "A meeting?" "With my executives," she clarified. His eyes widened. I don't think You don't have to think," she cut in. "Just show up." He wanted to say no. He wasn't supposed to be in places like that. He wasn't someone who sat at tables like those. But something in Eleanor's expression told him that she wasn't asking. And that was how he ended up here, in a room full of people waiting for him to fail. But what happened next? No one, not even Eleanor, was ready for it. The silence in the boardroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the antique clock mounted on the far wall. Daniel could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Every instinct in his body told him to get up and leave. This wasn't his world. This was a place for people with expensive watches and Ivy League degrees, not a janitor who spent his nights scrubbing floors. One of the executives, Martin Caldwell, leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie. His expression was polite, but the condescension behind it was impossible to miss. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, forcing a chuckle, "I'm sure we all appreciate the gesture, but I assume there's a point to this." Eleanor smiled slightly. Not the warm kind, the kind that let you know you were playing checkers while she was playing chess. "There is," she said. "Daniel is here because I want him to weigh in on today's discussion." A ripple of disbelief passed through the room. Lawrence Whitman, the CFO, shifted uncomfortably. "With all due respect," he said carefully, "today's agenda involves critical financial decisions. I don't see how he would have any relevant insight." Eleanor's smile didn't waver. "That's funny," she said, "because last week when I overheard Daniel explaining long-term investment strategies, he made more sense than half of you do in these meetings." A few people exchanged awkward glances. Lawrence's face twitched. "I'm serious," Eleanor continued. "Daniel has a unique perspective, one I think could be valuable. And considering the state of our company's underperforming assets, I'd say we need all the fresh ideas we can get." Martin exhaled sharply through his nose. "All right," he said, turning to Daniel. "Then by all means, impress us." The room went dead silent again. Daniel felt every pair of eyes on him, waiting, expecting him to stumble. His throat was dry. His palms were sweating. What was he supposed to say? For a brief second, he thought about getting up and walking out. But then he remembered why he was here. He thought about his father, about the long nights they spent at the dining table, running numbers, reading market reports, breaking down case studies from business journals his dad got from a second-hand bookstore. He thought about how much he had lost when his father passed away. How all of his knowledge, everything he had learned, had sat unused for years while he mopped floors and emptied trash bins. And suddenly, something clicked. Daniel took a deep breath, then looked directly at Martin. "You're worried about the underperforming assets?" he asked. Martin raised an eyebrow. "Obviously." Daniel nodded, not out of nervousness, but because he already knew the answer to the question no one in this room had been able to solve. "I read the reports," Daniel said, his voice gaining strength. "The problem isn't the assets. It's how you're evaluating them." Another murmur swept through the room. Martin scoffed. "Oh, And how do you suggest we evaluate them? Daniel leaned forward slightly. He wasn't nervous anymore. The same way a smart investor looks at a company during a recession, he said. Not by its current value, but by its potential value. The murmuring stopped. Eleanor smiled. This was exactly what she had been waiting for. But the real shock? That came when Daniel started breaking down numbers that even the top executives had overlooked. The room had changed. A few minutes ago, Daniel had been a janitor, an outsider, a man who didn't belong. But now he had their attention, real attention, the kind that only comes when people realize they might have underestimated someone. Badly. Martin leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His smirk was gone. All right, he said slowly. Let's say we're evaluating potential value instead of current value. What exactly are we missing? Daniel exhaled. He had spent years watching executives make decisions from a distance, but this was different. Now, he was in the ring. He looked directly at Lawrence, the CFO. The logistics division, Daniel said. That's the problem, right? Lawrence blinked, clearly caught off guard. How did you, Sam? I read the reports, Daniel interrupted. You're bleeding money because you're outsourcing distribution instead of optimizing internally. A silence settled over the table. Daniel didn't stop. The cost margins on your outsourcing contracts have increased by 12% in the last 2 quarters, but your internal fleet is running at less than 50% capacity. That means you're paying premium rates for services you already have the infrastructure to handle yourself. Lawrence shifted in his seat. We ran models that suggested... Daniel didn't flinch. Your models were built on outdated fuel cost projections and pre-pandemic freight rates. They don't apply anymore. The room was so quiet, you could have heard a pin drop. A junior executive, Alyssa Chen, looked down at her tablet, scrolling quickly. Wait, she muttered under her breath. He's right. Daniel continued. You're sitting on millions in underutilized assets, he said. Instead of cutting jobs, restructure the distribution model. Use the fleet. Cut outsourcing by 30%. That alone saves you at least $8 million annually. Another executive, a senior analyst, spoke up. If that's true, then why didn't we see it? Daniel turned to him. Because you weren't looking for it. A murmur spread across the table. Someone started whispering to the person next to them. Martin's face darkened, but he didn't say anything. Eleanor, sitting quietly at the head of the table, finally spoke. That's why Daniel is here, she said. The weight of her words settled over the room. Daniel swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if he had just made a career or a mistake. But then Lawrence let out a slow breath and leaned forward. Can you show us how to implement it? Daniel hesitated. This was the moment where he could back down or step up. He clenched his fists under the table. Then, with a voice steadier than he expected, he said, Yes. But no one was prepared for what Eleanor would say next. Silence stretched across the boardroom, thick and heavy. It was the kind of silence that followed a shift in power, a moment where things could no longer go back to the way they were before. Daniel had done the impossible. He hadn't just spoken up, he had proven them wrong. And now, everyone in that room knew it. Lawrence ran a hand over his jaw, glancing at Eleanor, then back at Daniel. His voice, once skeptical, was now careful. You're telling me we can cut $8 million in costs just by restructuring logistics? Daniel nodded. Alyssa Chen was still scrolling through numbers on her tablet, whispering calculations under her breath. It actually checks out, she murmured, almost to herself. Another executive leaned forward. And you figured this out just by reading reports? Daniel hesitated for a split second. He could feel the eyes on him. These were people who had spent years in corporate offices, sitting in high-backed leather chairs, making decisions that affected thousands of employees. And yet, here he was, a janitor, telling them something they should have already known. He chose his words carefully. "I pay attention," he said simply. A few of the executives exchanged looks, some impressed, some uneasy. "But Eleanor?" Eleanor was smiling. She turned to Lawrence. "How long have we been looking for a financial consultant?" Lawrence blinked. 6 months?" Eleanor nodded, then looked at Daniel. "You want the job?" The air shifted. Daniel stiffened. "What?" "I'm offering you a job," Eleanor repeated. Her voice was calm, firm, like she had made the decision long before she even walked into this meeting. "Financial consultant. Effective immediately." The room erupted. Martin's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he shot up from his seat. "Eleanor, be serious. You're offering a janitor a consultant position? Just like that?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "Yes." Lawrence pinched the bridge of his nose. "With all due respect, this isn't how we hire people." "It is today," Eleanor cut in. Martin let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You can't just—" "I own this company, Martin," Eleanor said, tilting her head. "I can do whatever I want." The room froze. Daniel sat there, stunned, his brain barely catching up to what was happening. A minute ago, he had been the janitor, the guy who mopped floors and emptied trash cans. Now he was being offered a seat at the table. I don't even have a degree," Daniel stammered. Eleanor waved a hand dismissively. "And half the idiots running billion-dollar hedge funds do?" She leaned forward, her gaze locked onto his. "I don't care about degrees, Daniel. I care about results. You saw something no one else in this room did. You solved a problem that's been eating into our profits for over a year, and I don't reward talent by letting it go to waste." Daniel's hands were sweating. He could barely breathe. I don't know what to say." Eleanor smiled. "Say yes." He should have hesitated. He should have overthought it. He should have worried about the fact that he didn't belong in a world like this. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a janitor anymore. He felt like someone who had earned his place. Daniel took a deep breath, and then he said the one word that would change his life forever. "Yes." But what happened after that? No one, not even Daniel, was ready for the truth that came next. The room was still buzzing when the meeting wrapped up. Executives whispered among themselves, some still reeling from Eleanor's decision, others secretly impressed by what had just happened. But Daniel was still trying to process it all. 1 minute he was a janitor. The next, he was a financial consultant at one of the most powerful companies in the city. It didn't feel real. As the board members filed out, Eleanor remained seated, watching Daniel with the kind of knowing look that made it clear. She had planned this from the start. "Walk with me," she said. Daniel hesitated, but he followed. They stepped out of the boardroom and into the private elevator, a place he'd never been before. The doors slid shut with a soft hum. For a moment, there was only silence between them. Then Eleanor spoke. "You think this was luck?" she asked, pressing the button for the top floor. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Wasn't it?" She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "No, Daniel, it wasn't." The elevator climbed higher. Daniel frowned. "I don't understand." Eleanor turned to him, her sharp gaze locking onto his. "I did my research," she said. "Before I ever walked into that break room, before I invited you to this meeting, I already knew everything about you." His stomach tightened. "What?" "I know your father owned a small business. I know you had to drop out of college when he passed away. I know you've been working jobs beneath your abilities because life didn't give you the luxury of options. Daniel swallowed hard. His fingers clenched at his sides. She continued. I also know that for the past 3 years, you've been reading financial reports in the janitor's closet during your breaks. I know you check stock trends on your phone before you clock in, and I know that every single person in this company has overlooked you. Until today. The weight of her words settled deep in his chest. This wasn't random. It wasn't a whim. She had been watching him. Daniel didn't know what to say. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open, revealing Eleanor's private office, a place most people in the company had never even seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the entire room, showcasing the city skyline. She stepped inside, motioning for him to follow. This company needs people who see things differently, she said, walking toward her desk. People who don't just sit in meetings, nodding along to bad decisions because they're afraid to question them. She turned to face him. That's why I hired you. Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind racing. I don't know if I can do this, he admitted. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Why not? He let out a dry laugh. Because I've spent my entire life being told I wasn't someone who gets jobs like this. Her eyes narrowed. Then let me be the first to tell you, you were lied to. Daniel stared at her, the weight of her words settling into his chest. She leaned back against her desk, crossing her arms. You have 2 choices, she said. You can let this opportunity scare you back into playing small, or you can do what you've always done. Pay attention, learn fast, and prove every single person in that boardroom wrong. He hesitated. Then he met her gaze and nodded. I'm in. Eleanor's lips curved into the smallest smirk. Good, she said, because your first official task starts tomorrow. But what happened next would test Daniel in ways he never saw coming. The next morning, Daniel walked into Harrington Enterprises for the first time not as a janitor, but as a consultant. The moment he stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor, he felt it. The stares. Some were skeptical, some were surprised, a few even hostile. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in their eyes, but Eleanor's voice echoed in his head. You were lied to. He adjusted the brand new suit jacket Eleanor had sent to his apartment that morning. It wasn't fancy, but it fit, and that was all that mattered. Alyssa Chen was waiting for him near the conference room. She glanced him up and down, her expression unreadable. Then, with a small nod, she handed him a stack of reports. Hope you're ready, she said. They're not going to go easy on you. Daniel took the papers, flipping through the numbers. He looked up, eyes steady. Good, he said. I wouldn't want them to. Alyssa's lips twitched, almost a smirk, before she pushed open the door. Inside, a group of high-level executives were already seated. Martin Caldwell was among them. He barely spared Daniel a glance. Lawrence, the CFO, adjusted his glasses. All right, he said, straight to the point. Harrington wants you to present a cost-saving strategy for logistics. Let's see what you've got. Daniel took a seat. He unfolded his notes, spreading them across the table. His heartbeat was steady this time. No more doubt. No more second-guessing. Because he knew his numbers. He knew the flaws in their system. And for the first time in his life, he knew that he belonged here. He looked around the room. Then, with the confidence of someone who had been overlooked for far too long, he began to speak. Life doesn't always give you the opportunities you deserve. Sometimes, the world tells you who you're supposed to be, and if you believe it, you stay stuck. But talent doesn't have a uniform. Intelligence doesn't come with a title. And sometimes, the only difference between sitting at the table and cleaning it is the chance to prove yourself. Daniel didn't get here because he was lucky. He got here because he was ready, long before anyone gave him a chance. So if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told you don't belong, remember this. You don't need permission to be great. You just need someone to finally notice. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. And if you've ever been overlooked, tell us your story in the comments. Because sometimes all it takes to change a life is the right person paying attention.